Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are calling in from. My name is Samir Gandusha, and I'm director of the Institute for the Humanities, and I'm delighted to invite you to the third installation of our launch for Spectres of Fascism, historical, theoretical, and international perspectives. Today we are going to focus on the third section, which really addresses the contemporary situation, which is looking more and more not just like the specters of fascism, but the materialization of those specters. This book, as I've mentioned before, comes out of a free school that we organized at the Institute 3 years ago. A number of the lecturers were a number of the lecturers contributed their talks to chapters and became chapters of the book. But then we also had others that we invited beyond that lineup, including the two contributors that we have with us today, Vladimir Zapatle from Brazil and Ajay Gudavarthy from India, who I will announce in due course. But I just wanted to say that at the time when we were thinking about how we go about mounting this free school, there was a degree of controversy over whether we should call this Spectres of Fascism as opposed to something on authoritarian populism or something of that nature. But we decided that we would go forward with it, and I think we are right in doing so retrospectively. But I think that gives you an indication of how things have developed since then, so over the last 3 years. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge that this event is being hosted on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I think this is especially apropos today insofar as one of the framing ideas of the book that I go into in some detail, and which I will just expand upon for a couple of minutes. I don't want to speak too much. We have other speakers that I, and no doubt all of you listening in, viewing, will want to hear from. But I do want to establish this frame because I think it's especially appropriate. And this is the idea of endocolonialism that we find in M.S. Césaire and Hannah Arendt in a different kind of register, and more recently elaborated upon by Enzo Traverso. So the idea that fascism is, in a sense, a self-colonization of Europe, that the techniques of violence and domination that are visited upon the colonized now, in a sense, come home. And so I think this is especially pertinent today, and I'll say a few things about why this is the case. What I'll do now is just introduce the format a little bit, and then I think before each speaker goes on, I will introduce them individually, so you don't forget who they are. And I think it's really important to know who each of these speakers are and where they're coming from, where they're located. This is, I think, really crucial to fully grasping their contributions. So I just want to refer to a couple of things in the introduction, just about this idea of endocolonialism, because I think it has a particular valence when looking at what's happening in the South, and I hope this resonates with Joan's understanding and experience. I wouldn't be presumed to speak, from a distance in any kind of truly authoritative way. I really want to hear from Joan about this. And Helmut-Harry has a lot of knowledge about this as well. Nonetheless, so the question of the relationship between fascisms past and present has received many different and contested answers. Yet in assessing and addressing this question, too few have considered Aimé Césaire's theory of endocolonialism, or the idea that fascism represents the application of modern European techniques of colonial domination to Europe itself. And again, the important exceptions to this are Hannah Arendt and Enzo Traverso. If we look at the present through that lens, we see how contemporary fascism is grounded in extractivism and not a kind of anti-humanism, but one could say a post-humanism. Anti-humanism refers to the way in which 20th century fascism was geared to, among other things, rolling back the universalist legacy of the Enlightenment and French Revolution. While colonialism proceeded apace in the 19th and 20th centuries, despite this legacy, the French Revolution nonetheless served as an important model for what C.L.R. James calls the Black Jacobins, the revolutionaries of Saint Domingo between 1791 and 1804, the first of many such national liberation struggles. Contemporary fascism, in contrast, one could argue, is based on a sort of post-humanism, insofar as it is becoming eminent clear in the present COVID-19 pandemic that it is based upon the seeming obsolescence and disposability of entire categories of persons. Police murders of Black men drive this home with particular force. The spirit of the post-human can be most clearly discerned in the neo-reactionary accelerationism of figures like Nick Land. Present-day fascism takes refuge in the past as such, in a supposedly great America before the Civil Rights Act, if not before the Civil War, in an authentic homeland of the Magyars in Hungary, or in a purified India for Hindustan. In other words, in an era of its ecologically planned obsolescence, contemporary fascism does not even bother to make claims on the future. There is no new order, so to speak, simply a tightening of the existing one, ever more rooted in the extraction of resources from the earth, the extraction of rent or interest from assets, and indeed massive investments in oil and gas, which have today never looked so precarious, which threaten to cancel the future outright by a kind of locked-in climate change. Today, finance has displaced industrial capital and exercises its power not just directly, that is by military means, but increasingly by means of the politics of debt. As Césaire remarks in Discourse on Colonialism, in noting the transition from colonialism to neo-colonialism in the immediate post-war period, and I quote, "Aid to the disinherited countries," and he's quoting Truman, "the time of the old colonialism has passed." That's also Truman, which means that American high finance considers the time has come to raid every colony in the world. So dear friends, here you have to be careful. The key point here is that, like 20th century fascism, contemporary authoritarianism also entails a self-colonization of Europe, as we see in the post-referendum case of Greece. What Christian Marazzi calls the violence of finance capital in the European context is also evident in Emmanuel Macron's use of brutally heavy-handed policing tactics against the Gilets jaunes, who have protested against austerity, amongst other things, in the Place de la République. Here we might point to the role of the security services as harbingers of fascism, insofar as they're often complicit with the far right and directly target the left. In the US, this becomes particularly palpable in the complicity between the police and members of armed far-right militias out patrolling the streets during the ongoing protests against structural inequality, racism, and over-policing of Black and brown communities. This is perhaps the most obvious form of endo-colonialism, in which the repressive arm of the state, militarized police forces, and the National Guard, and possibly at some point the military itself. So far they've resisted this, but who knows if they will at some point cave in to these demands. These constitute literal armies of occupation in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. The contemporary city comes to resemble the Senegalese reality depicted by Ousmane Sembène's 1963 film Baron Sarret, The Wagoner, which depicts the stark disparities between the quarters inhabited by the settlers on one hand and the natives on the other, which are enforced. This, what Du Bois calls the color line, is enforced by violence and brutality. So I think this idea of endo-colonialism is a particularly important and vital one. So let us now move on to the panel itself. just a word about the format. As I promised, each speaker will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then we'll go to questions. Those of you who are with us, please wait till the end of this session, because we'll take all the questions, comments at the end. And if you could keep your questions and comments as concise as possible, that would be very helpful, because as moderator, there's a lot going on, and it's hard sometimes to have to shorten questions on the spot. So please, a couple of sentences at the most. Okay, so without any further ado, I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, which is Ajay Gudavarthy, who is Associate Professor at the Center for Political Studies at JNU University in New Delhi. He's been a visiting fellow at Goldsmiths University of London, and a Charles Wallace Fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies, also at the University of London. Welcome, Ajay.
Thanks, Amit. Let me begin by congratulating you for this rather spectacle of discussing the spectres of fascism in a comparative perspective. So what I'll do is to really look at the contemporary context in India as to what do we mean by this fascism, what are the contours of it. And I must begin by saying that the essay that we contributed to your volume, in some sense, turned out to be prescient, because we began that essay by arguing in terms of agrarian crisis and circular migrants. And during the pandemic and the lockdown, if some of you are following the Indian case, there was a huge humanitarian crisis in terms of the migrant crisis who wish to return back from the urban and peri-urban areas back to the rural areas, villages where they come from, and there was no way for them to return, and many of them were caught midway. Many of them died of hunger, exhaustion, fatigue, so on and so forth. And that partly, I think, reflects the material reality on the ground in terms of Indian labor force. Of almost more than 80% belongs to the informal sector, and this has been described quite differently by sociologists like Joan Braun and others as part of being unfree labor, neo-bondage, modern slavery, so on and so forth. And on top of this, we have the constitutional liberal constitutionalism and the liberal state. We have the functioning liberal democracy, and then the civil society. And that's how it's vertically, almost vertically divided. And therefore, I would remark that the current trend of fascism or populist authoritarianism in India is actually fascism from below. That there is a large-scale consent rather than it being centralized, state-driven, driven exclusively through extra-institutional surveillance methods by a police state. There is, unlike what we are witnessing now in Brazil, that Bolsonaro is losing out his popular support in Brazil after or during the pandemic. But in India, most surveys are showing that there is actually a surge in terms of popular support to the current regime, in spite of the way it has mishandled. And there are, I think, large social, material, and cultural reasons as to why. So I'll briefly present on how to make sense of this kind of fascism from below. That, as I said, so partly, therefore, this legal constitutional state as is witnessed today in the Indian context as a representative of some kind of an entitled elite privilege. And therefore, there is a kind of a concentric mass anger against constitutional liberal institutions in India. And this is what has led to the emergence of the strongman phenomena under the leadership of current Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi. And therefore, I see a kind of a reinforcing dialectic between the strongman phenomena and the extra-institutional street violence that is almost like an organized violence that goes on in India. Therefore, one reinforces the other. The larger the crisis through street violence, more is the need for strongman. And therefore, we are witnessing something close to what Carl Smith refers to as the sovereign dictator, that declaring sovereign is someone who has the ability to declare the exception. And therefore, the current regime is consciously, almost by design, one would presume, pushing a certain kind of a civic crisis and declaring an exception by suspending all known legal forms, including civil rights. Recently, during the pandemic, they went through a massive labor reforms, which included suspending minimum wages. It included suspending the limitation on labor hours. They've extended to 14 hours as they estimate, so on and so forth. And these are massive, and abandoning trade union organization of trade unions in any form. Therefore, in spite of that, what is interesting is that it continues to be that a trade-off between this kind of a neoliberal, aggressive, predatory neoliberalism and cultural nationalism. That the exclusion, what the current regime is attempting at least, is that the economic exclusion is made good through a kind of a cultural inclusion. How long that's going to work, how it's going to pan out, is really going to decide the future of this kind of an authoritarian experiment that is on in India currently. So that's the first part, that there is this kind of a sovereign dictator, a strongman born from a large-scale disowning of constitutional liberal institutions. And this is interestingly happening from both ends. The elites are abandoning the sovereign, the constitutional liberal institutions out of the anxiety of the process of democratization that has taken place in India during the last 3 decades in terms of inclusion of the lower end, lower end classes, lower castes, backward castes, so on and so forth. And that has created a kind of a hurt pride and an anxiety among the social elites, which is why they are critical of the known liberal institutions and constitutionalism. And at the lower end, there is an increasing aspiration that has grown out of the neoliberal reforms. From 10 years inclusion, they're looking for quicker mobility in terms of economic, social, and political mobility, enlargement of representation. And therefore, they also find the current liberal institutions, both representational and otherwise, have been inadequate in terms of accommodating their mobility. And therefore, even they are disbanding liberal constitutional framework. So from both ends, that therefore, and the current political regime is, in this sense, the Hindutva, the far right Hindu regime in India, is hegemonic in this sense that it is able to churn out a narrative that has appeal for both ends of the society. That the social elites, the traditional elites, find that their social privileges being reinforced through the far right kind of a close totalitarian Hindu state narrative. And the lower end classes are also interestingly finding their social narrative represented by the ideal of Hindu Rashtra. So on one hand, they're politicizing the hurt, pride, and anxiety of the social elites, and politicizing the stigma of the lower classes. So I find this interesting dialectic, that how an hegemony is being formed in terms of how a narrative has multiple dimensions to speak to various sections of the society. And what this is leading to, as I've argued in the paper that have contributed to volume, is that it is really moving us away from known forms of social structuration and social stratification. That political subjectivity is no longer operating strictly within the known social location of caste and class. That there is a certain kind of a flexibilization that has happened, where people can move out, and therefore new forms of social solidarities, social alliances are being made possible by the current Hindu right political regime. And this is where I refer to them as the new cultural subalterns. That the social elites who suffer from anxiety and hurt pride, and the lower end castes and classes who suffer from stigma, are both able to see their adversary in terms of liberal constitutionalism, in terms of it, propagating a system of entitlement. And therefore, there is a new kind of an alliance that is that I see on the ground, that is emerging in a very unlikely fashion between traditional social elites and the subaltern castes and classes. So this is something I think very unique to the current regime. And the political subjectivity that is emerging from this is that most social groups feel like subalterns and think like elites, that they wish to reproduce the existing hierarchies from their social vantage point, but they are morally justifying that project in terms of projecting a certain kind of a victimhood. And to go back to quote David Goodhart's interesting formulation between somewheres and anywheres, that there is this tiny cosmopolitan English-speaking urban elite, which even the Prime Minister refers to as the Lutyens' Delhi. You know, the Lutyens is the heart of the capital city, where you have this English-speaking elites constituted by the old-time bureaucrats, journalists, academics like us, who are the somewheres, who are the anywheres, who are like liberal, constitutional, and cosmopolitan in nature. But the majority of population continues to be somewheres, territorially located, culturally bound, and they seem to find a kind of an adversarial relation at both ends. And therefore, the current regime is able to generate a kind of a political hegemony that can appeal to both ends of the and in terms of community and capital, somebody tell me the time so that I just time myself. Your voice, you're muted.
About 5 or 7 minutes?
Yeah, sure. So, and the other interesting dimension with what Sami was also referring to in his initial remarks in terms of colonial modernity, I think it also leads to a number of interesting questions in the Indian context in terms of the interface between modernity and capitalism. That do we, in post-colonial democracies like in India, which have sort of had the modernity through colonial capitalism itself, that do we now have to, what kind of an interface exists between capitalism and modernity, I think works pretty differently from the European and advanced capitalist societies. So the current populist regime, in one sense, very interestingly, is pro-corporate but anti-modern. That it is reinforcing traditional hierarchies, but it is also pushing through corporate capital very aggressively through neoliberal reforms, labor reforms, so on and so forth. And this is leading to very interesting kind of dynamics that they are pushing high-end capitalism, high-end urbanization, in that sense, dislocation of traditional communities. As you can see, migrant crisis is one of them, who are dislocated from their traditional spaces. But they're also reinforcing a traditional communitarian language in terms of caste, gender relations, in terms of religious imagination, so on and so forth. Therefore, you have in Indian context a tiny left liberal, most of the left liberal section, which has a critique of capitalism but has no critique of modernity. And you have the Indian right, which has a critique of modernity but has no critique of capitalism in place. So much of the political subjectivity that I see in India is actually an interplay between these two ends of the spectrum. And right is, I think, able to locate itself very intelligently within this dialectic, and this is what I refer to in my book, India After Modi, as performative dialectics. That where most liberal left critical theory discourses analyze in terms of binaries, I in fact find the right having more investment in dialectics, and they are the true Gramscians of today rather than the left. That they are truly invested in some kind of a dialectical thinking of drawing continuities where many of us see binaries and contradictions, which I think is an extremely fascinating thing as a political theorist. But as a political animal, these are very, very ominous to see how they're able to draw these linkages between various processes. To just sort of explain very quickly how they're able to form this monolithic Hindu imagination of Hindu Rashtra in a society as diverse as India, in terms of ethnic, in terms of linguistic, regional, religious, caste diversity, I think is in itself a humongous process. And they've had a fair amount of success in terms of generating this monolithic imagination because of this kind of a performative dialectic thinking, where, for instance, if you take the question of caste, they're able to subdivide larger congregations of caste, of Dalits or backward castes, into smaller subcastes. This would have ideally been read as a process of social fragmentation. But what you find in India today is that the more there is social fragmentation of castes into smaller subcastes, it is further reinforcing their dependence on a more militant kind of a monolithic muscular imagination of a unified Hindu nation. So how this dialectic would play out, that smaller fragmentation would actually lead to more investment in a more unified kind of a Hindu identity, I think is a very interesting and intriguing phenomena to observe in India. That your social, your vulnerability in terms of social power, when you're fragmented into smaller groups, is made good by giving you, investing you and drawing you into a unified muscular Hindu identity. Therefore, for purposes of representation, you are a Dalit, but for the purposes of recognition, you are a Hindu. So to get material benefits in terms of reservations to public offices, education, jobs, you remain a Dalit. But to compensating mechanism of recognition, you become a Hindu. Therefore, there's a very interesting kind of dynamics, and this seems to speak in a very organic sense to the experiential dimension of politics. Now, as Nancy Fraser once very famously said, that socialism is cognitively compelling but experientially distanced. I think the Hindu right is able to bridge that that gap between the cognitive and the experiential processes by drawing in these kinds of very unlikely linkages, which were not perhaps possible to imagine even a decade back in Indian society, that was otherwise thought to be rigid in terms of its social stratification. So I'll conclude by arguing that there is an interesting phenomenon of this is a fascism. There is no doubt it's a very totalitarian, highly monolithic, hierarchical system that is being put in place, but that is happening precisely by subverting the progressive liberal left kind of a language of rights, liberty, and equality, being tied to ideas of order, and fraternity and community. Therefore, I think the most dangerous part of this fascism is that it is from below, that there is a mass consent that is based on, and therefore, in terms of its social and material processes, have a certain kind of a structural linkage to the kind of performative dialectics that the right wing is performing. So I'll conclude there, Samit. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ajay. Yeah, a couple of things there that I'd just like to point out that resonate particularly strongly. I mean, one is it seems that the Hindutva agenda, the RSS and BJP, in some ways takes up the colonial strategy of divide and conquer in terms of these subgroups, further subdivision within caste identities. But also something that Tamir Braune said in a previous session about the way in which the right has really appropriated Gramsci in particular, but other leftist ideas, some postmodern ideas, but Gramsci in particular. This has been very clear with the French New Right. So I think that resonates very nicely there. All right, great. So let's move on to our next speaker. Which is Joan Braun, who's a lecturer in philosophy at Gonzaga University, just south of the border in Washington State. She's the author of Erich Fromm's Revolutionary Hope, Prophetic Messianism as a Critical Theory of the Future, and that's published in 2014. Welcome, Joan.
Thank you, Samir. Thanks for organizing this. I also have a new co-edited volume out, by the way. I'll just add on Fromm as well. So it's exciting to see some resurgence of work on Fromm. Really excited to be part of this project, and I got to present up in Vancouver at the Free School as well, as I think everyone probably on the panel did. Just wonderful that Samir's organizing this. So my chapter in this book addresses Steve Bannon, and particularly the role of traditionalism in Bannon's ideology. Traditionalism with a capital T is an anti-modern, anti-enlightenment, esoteric, mystical school of thought with significant affinities with fascism, and including outright fascist thinkers such as Julius Evola. The traditionalists believe in a lost primal religion, echoes of which are maintained in some of today's world religions, and that certain elite spiritual leaders are qualified to become initiates into this secret esoteric content. More crucially, for the political context in which we find ourselves, traditionalists also believe that history moves in cycles of decline, apocalyptic catastrophe, and rebirth. And they believe that at historical highs in this cycle, societies are characterized by a natural social hierarchy akin to the Hindu caste system, or the four social classes corresponding to different qualities of souls described in Plato's Republic. According to the traditionalists, our current era is a turning point, a moment of collapse and rebirth. We are nearing the end of the Hindu Kali Yuga, or age of decline, on their view. In Hinduism, from which traditionalism significantly appropriates, the Kali Yuga ends with the return of Kalki, an avatar of Vishnu. Esoteric Hitlerism, like that of Savitri Devi and Miguel Serrano, leans heavily on the work of traditionalist thinkers to argue that Hitler was Kalki, or a forerunner of Kalki. Bannon is deeply influenced by the traditionalist school since at least the early 90s, and he alludes to it fairly frequently, citing particularly the influence of René Guénon, and somewhat more cautiously, because of his obvious ties to fascism, Julius Evola. As Benjamin Teitelbaum's new book, War for Eternity, reveals, Bannon's commitment to traditionalist ideology places him within a global far-right network, which he is seeking to manipulate and lead. Meeting recently with Russian fascist Alexander Dugin was part of Bannon's project in this area, as are his ongoing conversations with Olavo de Carvalho, Bolsonaro's advisor, who lives in the United States and broadcasts his far-right views and esoteric theories about extraterrestrial life and so on back to his followers in Brazil. Teitelbaum's new book, by the way, is unquestionably written with a sympathy for traditionalist, fascist, and white nationalist ideology. He appears to be in awe of Bannon and fascinated by the rituals and beliefs of traditionalists. He skirts frequently around talking about anti-Semitism, racism, or fascism, instead glamorizing the traditionalists. It reads rather like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, with the cool secret society being Nazis instead of Knights Templar. Teitelbaum, a professor of ethnomusicology whose research focuses on white power music, has also written a journal article recently defending a friendship model of research on fascists, describing his friendships with and at times collaboration with and advocacy for a number of fascists and white nationalists. I consider his new book, Glamorizing Bannon, to be dangerous, not least because Bannon continues to be influential. Bannon played a significant role in shaping the Tea Party movement, and through his propaganda films, once referring to himself as the Leni Riefenstahl of the Republican Party. He worked with Nigel Farage to secure a victory for Brexit through his involvement with Cambridge Analytica. He edited far-right website Breitbart and helped to forge the Trump movement, and served as a campaign advisor and White House advisor in the first 6 months of the Trump presidency. Bannon left the Trump administration shortly after the August 2017 Charlottesville white supremacist rally, amid calls for his resignation. During his time in the White House, he vied with Jared Kushner and Ivanka for Trump's support, and was rumored to be considering a future presidential campaign. For the next few months after leaving the White House after Charlottesville, Bannon focused on the upcoming election, pushing a variety of racist and right-wing candidates, including Roy Moore in Alabama and Ed Gillespie in Virginia. Bannon's message, repeated at campaign stop after campaign stop, was that Trump's populist economic nationalism needed to be defended. Despite defending notoriously racist candidates like Roy Moore and surrounding himself with racist and right-wing extremists, Bannon insisted that populist economic nationalism had nothing to do with race. Instead, it was about the little guy, the hobbits, the deplorables, the peasants, versus the elites and the globalists. Bannon insisted that the American people would see this, and that they would see charges of racism against these candidates as desperation and a distraction, and that they would vote even more enthusiastically for these right-wing populists. Perhaps spurred on by his memory of Trump's victory following the supposedly damning revelations of Trump's pussy grabbing, Bannon seemed to think that these sexual assault allegations against Roy Moore wouldn't stick at the polls either. He calculated wrong, though. Moore and Gillespie were both defeated, and that didn't look good for Bannon's analysis. He left the country at that point, beginning to travel in Europe and build international allies. It is dangerously easy to dismiss Bannon now, and to consign him to the heap of other fired former Trump administration officials on whom we no longer need to keep particular tabs. Unfortunately, we still have to pay attention to Bannon. Since leaving the Trump administration, Bannon has been on a global mission to build an international network of far-right nationalists. Although Bannon is eclectic, erratic, and not a serious thinker, his political and philosophical aspirations have greater consistency than many have acknowledged. His belief, grounded in traditionalism, that history is at a turning point, that destruction is necessary to reset the world, that new leaders are needed, and that generations of people have particular ordained roles to play in history, continues to shape his politics. We should be concerned with that consistency for what it reveals about the possibility of his influence in several respects. First, Bannon is consistently enthusiastic and excited about racial conflict. He even wrote a version of Shakespeare's Coriolanus set during the Watts riots. It is about as full of approximations of African American slang and racist assumptions as you'd expect. Following the Charlottesville March, at which numerous people were assaulted by racists and Heather Heyer was killed, Bannon seemed uniquely gleeful. "Say the revolution is coming," he said. "I can't get enough. Tear down more Confederate statues." Of course, his enthusiasm wasn't about support for racial justice movement, but Bannon saw an opportunity for apocalyptic cataclysm and rebirth. On a podcast episode this week, Bannon claimed that the Black Lives Matter protests are a plot controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, which leads to a second area of concern. Bannon is currently focusing heavily on whipping up anti-China fervor. His daily podcast focuses on blaming China for the coronavirus. It's called Bannon's War Room. It's today on its 213th episode. Bannon now receives $1 million a year from a Chinese billionaire to constantly attack the Chinese Communist Party, a role he has taken on quite happily. He is collaborating with the Chinese anti-communist cult, the Falun Gong, to build support for their newspaper, the Epoch Times, whose YouTube ads often feature a young man in a Richard Spencer-like haircut and vest talking about traditionalism. He claims to be building an alternative Chinese government and preparing it for takeover. It is not the only foreign policy agenda Bannon has, however. He has been advocating for a long time for war on Iran. He will also continue to paint others as enemies and to whip up anti-immigrant and anti-refugee policies. His obsession with walls, as I point out in my chapter in Spectres of Fascism, is tied to his commitment to traditionalist ideology. Here he is quoted in Teitelbaum's recent book. "I am a huge believer that we are a country with a border and a wall, and a country that has a culture and a civilization and citizens and Americanness to it all, right? That's a country, and if that's called blood and soil, so be it. But we are a country, we are a thing with a people and a set of customs and traditions," end quote. The reference to the Nazi slogan of blood and soil is rather glaring here, of course, but moreover, he sounds rather like the French New Right, maybe Alain de Benoit. Third, Bannon's obsession with generations and with youth means that he will continue to look for ways to stoke far-right and fascist youth movements. He has recently received permission to go ahead with creating a school in an abandoned Italian monastery, where he will be gathering young far-right activists with political aspirations. This is consistent with his time at Breitbart and his prior work in the tech industry, profiting from the video game World of Warcraft. At Breitbart, Bannon gathered together youth, including young women like Julia Hahn, who's now in the Trump administration, and Katie McHugh, who has had a change of heart and exposed Stephen Miller's ties to white nationalism. He called this grouping of energetic young women around Breitbart his Valkyries, an allusion to Wagner or Norse mythology that is typical of the way Bannon frequently name drops references to fascist ideology in ways that allow him a slight margin of plausible deniability. Milo Yiannopoulos, the now almost forgotten brash campus culture warrior, was also a Bannon creation, we should remember. Upon discovering Milo, Bannon enthused that Milo would be great because he has no conscience. Fourth and finally, and perhaps most importantly, I think, we need to be concerned about Bannon's attempts to play to the left. Although he cannot present himself as a leftist convincingly in the American context, Bannon knows how to manipulate others and to build messages and campaigns. For some time, he has spoken of attempting to create a Breitbart for the left. He hopes a populist message can be used to stoke nationalism and to stoke nationalism and pit an American working class against global elites. But these will not be cast as capitalists, but as manipulators of capitalism, rehashing traditional anti-Semitic tropes of conspiratorial control. Consider how Tucker Carlson of Fox News, for example, one of the other most dangerous figures in American politics right now, and probably a future presidential candidate, combines occasional nods to a welfare state or critiques of U.S. intervention, imperial intervention, with and advocacy for racism, misogyny, and a host of other extremist beliefs. Untrained to recognize the ways in which fascism always appropriates from the left, many Americans are routinely confused by this, seeing figures like Carlson as complicated or occasionally correct, instead of recognizing the pattern as evidence of something like National Socialist sympathies. I would also like to say on this theme that as critical theorists, we should be paying particular attention to the influence of the critical theory journal Telos on the Trump administration, including the presence of Russell Berman and David Pan in Mike Pompeo's Commission on Inalienable Rights. In a recent co-authored op-ed for Fox News, Berman sounded almost exactly like Bannon, calling the coronavirus, quote, an opportunity for the West to become great again, to defeat the virus and to face down China that sent it to us. He's also hailed Trump, by the way, as sort of a hero for standing up to the administrative state and used some kind of Adorno-like language to praise Trump. Telos has been promoting the French New Right for some time, including Elaine de Benoit. It's just an example. I think any spaces in which critical theory or traditions of left thought are being appropriated to promote right-wing ideology are spaces where we should be pushing back aggressively against fascism's continued attempts to appropriate from the left. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Joan. Yeah, Bannon has spoken about the deconstruction of the administrative state, and he's at times been given to praising Lenin, another way of appropriating important, not just thinkers, but real figures and leaders from the left. So very interesting. Thank you. So next up we have Patricia Barkaskas, colleague of mine from across the city, who is academic director of the Indigenous Community Legal Clinic and an instructor at Peter A. Allard School of Law. Patricia has practiced in the areas of child protection, as parents counsel, civil, criminal, family, and prison law. Welcome, Patricia.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay, great. So first of all, as Samir has already done, I, as an Indigenous person, feel obliged to also acknowledge the traditional, unceded, and ancestral and sovereign territories that I'm speaking to you from today, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people here in Vancouver, British Columbia. My work at the University of British Columbia takes place specifically on Musqueam territory, and the Indigenous Community Legal Clinic at which I work is on overlapping and interlocking territories in Vancouver's downtown east side. I want to thank my fellow panelists today for their contributions to this conversation, which is clearly an ongoing conversation. And as we've seen in the year or so since I think we submitted our final submissions to Samir and to the editors, things have increasingly become less and less spectre-like as we move into what is now the present and what was then the future. So this morning, as I begin, I just want to I'm burning some smudge, and I'm doing that to acknowledge all of the many people whose lives have been taken from them and who have been killed and who have been murdered. And I want to use those words very specifically because I keep seeing headlines talk about loss of life. And these lives aren't being lost. These lives are taken. These people are being killed and they are being murdered. And so I want to take a moment to just express my solidarity for Black Lives Matter, to the people who are on the ground doing the work of resisting state violence and murder of the people that they call their family, their friends, their community. And I want to acknowledge that as an Indigenous person in Canada, today I'm going to be speaking specifically to the context for Indigenous peoples. It would be inappropriate for me to speak to the situation for Black people in Canada and people of color, but I do want to acknowledge that those realities are very similar in that the police kill Black people and people of color in Canada regularly. This happens without much notice and without much attention, and I think that's worth recognizing because Canada has a history of trying to normalize its goodness in the face of these things and of the genocide that it has committed against Indigenous people, and that is something that needs to be said aloud and needs to be said, I think, over and over and over again. And obviously the approach I'm taking here this morning is much like my approach in the chapter, which is that it's personal, it's reflective, and I am theorizing from a place of experience and of observation in terms of the work that I do with and for other Indigenous people in Canada in resisting the Canadian state and in trying to illuminate the ongoing injustice of colonialism in Canada. And so in doing that, I think it's also incredibly important to point out that in the midst of everything that we're experiencing right now and the righteous and justified response of people on the ground to the deaths of their friends, families, loved ones, and community members, that the anniversary of the inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit, non-binary, gender non-conforming folks here in Canada passed this week without so much as an issued statement on what the government here in Canada or in our provinces and territories was planning to do about the ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples. And in that, we see what has come to be, it's not a new normal, it's an always normal here, in that the lack of acknowledgement of this perpetuated and ongoing genocide is simply the status quo. And as I say in the chapter, I really think that for Indigenous peoples in Canada, and I think that we can also say, and again, I can't speak to the particular histories, but for Black folks and many people of color whose histories are all different in the ways that they have come to be here in this place that we now call Canada, that the historic and ongoing imposition of the imperial state apparatus and the ongoing nightmare of colonialism express themselves not so much as a shadowy prospect in the present, but as a fact of everyday life and reality. And the sustained colonial project has expressed through law, policy, procedure, and again, just the normal and everyday enactment of living in Canada provides simply an unacknowledged and abstracted reality of the erasure of Indigenous lives, and that reality is part of what the inquiry, the national inquiry, was responding to when they talked about genocide. And much was made of that, about whether or not we should actually be able to call what's happened to Indigenous people in Canada genocide. And lots of theorists weighed on that, legal and otherwise. But I think that it's important to not abstract that through the theoretical confines of legalities that are created by the very state apparatus or the very state apparati globally that commit genocide in all kinds of contexts, where colonialism, imperialism, and fascism, in fact, have been realities and continue to be realities for people. So as we move through what is our present, which I think is fair to say for Indigenous peoples is intimately connected to our pasts and our futures in a way that is simultaneously simultaneously real and lived. There isn't much about our present reality that is shocking or that that is surprising. The deaths of the people around us, and I'm just going to read a list of only a very, very few names, but some that might be recognizable to people, of Indigenous people who have been murdered in Canada in the last number of years. I'm going to start with Chantal Moore, who was recently killed by police. Regis Korchinski-Paquette, who was an Indigenous Afro woman who was killed in Toronto. Her family says that the police pushed her off of a balcony, 24 stories up. Del Culver, also murdered by the RCMP. His family is seeking an inquest into his death. Colton Boushie, who was killed by Gerald Stanley, who was acquitted of his murder by white jurors in Saskatchewan. And it's important to note that Colton was killed because he came onto someone's property, because he came onto a white farmer's property, and in doing so committed an ultimate transgression for Indigenous people, for Indigenous bodies, and that is invade white space, or what is now considered to be white space. Cindy Gladue, who was murdered and whom the state reprehensibly subjected to further victimization by bringing her dismembered body into our courts without apology, without the consent of her family. Tina Fontaine, who was murdered in Winnipeg after she sought state help through the child welfare services that were supposed to be there to support her, not just once, but at least a half a dozen times she sought assistance. And so these are just a few names of people who have been not shockingly been murdered and killed in the context of the Canadian state's violence, which is normalized against Indigenous peoples and Indigenous bodies. And that normalization is especially galling in the guise that it wears of a Canadian colonial state that is abstracted to seem kind, to seem generous, to seem peaceful, that hides what's really happening. And I bring this up because it's so prevalent in the conversations that I'm seeing on social media and in the news about Canada not having the same race problem that the United States has. And although my chapter in the book talks about this all in a much more interconnected way to the issues that the other panelists are talking about today, I just sort of wanted to bring us into the present, to think about the ways that the present is intimately connected to the issues that come up in this book, and why it is important and why it is timely, and how we find ourselves, or at least how I find myself, sitting outside today in Vancouver, in BC, in Canada, not really certain about how to move forward at all, and feeling unable to respond with even the righteous anger that I should be able to muster, but can't, in the face of what we see happening around the world. But again, especially wanting to acknowledge what's happening in the US, and thinking about Black Lives Matter, and also thinking about the situation here in Canada in terms of Black Lives Matter, but also Indigenous folks. And so I'm going to leave it there this morning, and just thank you all for listening, and thank you for again your my fellow panelists, your contributions to this conversation, and thank you for bringing us together for these panels at this important time, Samir.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I just want to echo some of the comments that have been received about how incredibly important and moving your words were, and how it's important that you named the names of those not killed but murdered. And we really have to recognize the manner in which the settler colonial nature of the state here in Canada is brutal in its own way. And there's a tendency in Canada to always point the finger at the United States without at all understanding and acknowledging what's been going on here for centuries. I'd also just like to say two things, and that is that as part of the initial formation of fascism in the 20th century, particularly in Germany, but also in Italy as well, the violent colonial imaginary that was constituted in Italian involvement in Abyssinia and German involvement, German colonialism in the southwestern part of Africa, fed into and helped to constitute what we understand as 20th century fascism, as did the westward expansion of the United States, right? And the idea of the very act and imagination of colonization drove the Nazis' understanding of Lebensraum. So there is a really, I think, overdetermined relationship here. And I think it's so important you drew attention to the kind of lived reality and lived experience of this. So thank you again, Patricia. It was wonderful. So now we have Vladimir Zapata, who is professor of philosophy and psychology at the University of Sao Paulo, who has also been visiting scholar at UC Berkeley and an invited professor at the Université de Paris, Toulouse, and Loewen. There's much I could say about Vladimir, but I think one thing that's especially worthy of note was that he was the host of Judith Butler when she came, and was quite violently attacked by a mob who were opposing gender ideology, which is a very important trope of the contemporary right, not just in Brazil but globally. You have the floor, Vladimir. Welcome.
Okay, then let's start again. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very glad to be here to discuss these points with you. Actually, I just wrote a small text focus on two main questions. The first one is if we can use fascism to describe the Brazilian contemporary situation, and especially what we gain with that, why we should do that. Because I would like to present a hypothesis is that Brazil is today a kind of world laboratory for a new type of authoritarian neoliberalism. And this new type of authoritarian neoliberalism is linked in too many ways with some trends or some trace of, let's say, the fascist politics. And especially if we think in a country like Brazil, it's a country based, let's say, on the slavery plantation. This is the main core of the Brazilian society. Even after, let's say, the obsolescence of this slavery plantation in the economical field, let's say, the Brazilian society is organized upon that. And we know slavery plantation is a kind of social structure of an ontological division. And I said ontological division because we have two types of subjects. These subjects that can be recognized as persons. Then if they die, there will be mourning, there will be narrative, there will be, let's say, a history to tell. but there is also this subject that is put in the position of things. Then if there is, when they die, there is no mourning, there is nothing, there is just numbers. We know that this is, let's say, our necropolitical core of our state. And of course, a type of state like that, that is really organized upon this characteristic, it's a very welcome state to be a world laboratory to this authoritarian neoliberalism with fascist traits. Well, saying that, I would like just to start this text saying that there is no word that would make us more afraid of its use than fascism. However, it is what we heard more and more insistently when it comes to the current Brazilian situation. And then I would like to ask, in the straightforward and simple way, a question that several of us in Brazil have already asked ourselves: would Brazil be moving toward fascism? Well, the question is not heard only in Brazil, it's heard also in Hungary, Poland, Philippines, and this confluence of perplexed faiths making the world tour is no accident. It indicates a global gap that seems to be gradually growing, a gap where the emergence of new forms of government with clearly fascist traits would pass. But maybe the interesting way to start this debate is asking, aren't such governments simply populists? Isn't that what we say today, right-wing populist governments? But what if this extensive use of the term populism was actually a way of not calling a cat, as the French said? For perhaps we call them populists, not to say that they really are, not to say what they really are. Governments in which a certain conception of total state, an explicit form of implosion of any possibility of social solidarity with historically vulnerable groups, a paranoid notion of nation, and the cult of violence. All these characteristics are, let's say, the real keynote of this type of government. But is this exactly fascism? And why not talk about populism in this case? Well, I would like to remember how the extensive use of the notion of populism came back. At least 10 years ago, it had become clear that world politics tended to move to extremes. The inability to respond to the process of social degradation caused by the economic crisis of 2008, that is, the inanity of neoliberal policies against the economic crisis, and its sharing to a greater or lesser extent by all the main political actors, had caused such a de-identification with the instituted power, such a frustration of those who once believed in the sirens of globalization, that the strengthening of extremes was an irresistible tendency. Liberal democracy had reached its limit, because the problem was not only economical, it was mainly political. There was no space in the political field for actions and discourse of clear break with the economic order responsible for the impoverishment of incredibly larger sections of the population. Faced with a desire to strongly refuse the limits of our institutional life, this magic word, populism, was created that makes everything that calls to put everything that calls into question the systems of paralysis and agreements of parliamentary liberal democracy that was, with this idea, seen as irrational, emotional, fruit of frustrations, invitation to regressions, that is populist. Well, still breaking the term made it possible to bring the extremes together, to speak of right-wing populism and left-wing populism, thereby nullifying the two poles, making them operate on a balance of equivalence, as if there was only the liberal democracy we know and populisms. But it was clear the existence of deep difference between the poles. On the right, there was a criticism of social impoverishment that placed the account of the catastrophe on the back of the most disadvantaged, namely immigrants with subhuman labor relations, submitted to subhuman labor relations, refugees, victims of the consequence of imperialist interventions in areas of perennial conflict like Middle West. And when there were no large waves of immigrants in view, the mobilization of splittings originating from race and gender was seen in a reissue of strategies whose fascist resonance was evident. On the right wing, there was still the whole imaginary about the frontier, the immunity of the social body, the invasion, the contagion, returning directly to Goebbels' most inflamed speech. Well, that is, there was no proximity between the poles, the right wing and the left wing, but we were faced with a practice of normalization of the extreme right. And the recovering the topic of populism was really useful. Because to refuse its normalization would end up taking all the anti-institutional force to the other pole, and thereby producing a rupture without negotiation with the current economic order. But none of this answered the question posed before, namely, was Brazil reading toward fascism? Well, Brazil is a country with a long fascist history. The Brazilian fascist movement, known as National Integralist Action, reached 1,200,000 members in the 30s. Colonial violence, racism as a result of slavery society that abolished slavery only in the last decade of the 19th century, served as a ferment, a base, a ground for the preservation of fascism among us. For example, it is very interesting, in the Dictionary of Social Thought of the 20th century, edited by William Outwaite and others, Brazil is the only country mentioned, together with South Africa, as having harbored a fascist movement outside Europe between 1918 and 1945. In view of that, perhaps it was the case to raise some traits that have the strength to speak for itself. When Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt sought to explain what the total fascist state was, he took care to make a distinction. According to him, we would know a form of total state within parliamentary democracies in the Weimar Republic. It is that state that listens to all sides of society, that is present in all social conflicts, and that produces structures of mediation and legislation in all spheres of social life. He seeks to account for labor conflicts, inequality problems, specific violence against vulnerable groups, among others. The state, let's say, this type of state, called, say, Schmitt, is everywhere. It cannot hover above society and to decide above the social conflicts. And against this, Schmitt will say we need another type of total state. But the role of this total state, of new type, he said something like a qualitative total state, will be different. It must use all its strength and force to depoliticize society, prevent schools from being the focus of sedition and training, prevent workers to put in pressure on their boss through legal obligations, use police force to prevent strikes, paralyzes occupations, and so on. Thus one can guarantee the only real freedom, namely the economical freedom, which is always a freedom for someone, or rather for those of the same one. This was the total fascist state, a type of state that we saw implemented here in Latin America, especially in Chile. That was the first neoliberal laboratory in the Chile of Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet. And exactly this model is the model that we are trying to, let's say, to implement here in Brazil. And finally, and this was an accurate understanding of Franz Neumann in Beirut, the Nazi state does not rule. It is an unstable association between groups that are in continuous conflict. But this conflict is a way of perpetuating the movement, since it allows the government to enter into continuous conflict with the state. Always saying that our great project, the biggest project, is not being implemented because obscure forces are acting within the state to prevent our great redemption. It's a type of conflict between government and state. The Nazi state is a permanent crisis raised in the condition of government. And we see that working exactly like that in Brazil. And I would like to stress also a last point. It's we all know this topic of a necropolitical state, but what we are dealing with here in Brazil is not exactly that anymore. I would like to use this Paul Villerio concept that maybe is very useful in this situation. Is a suicidal state. Why is a suicidal state? Because, for example, what we have seen here in these last two months, we have seen people in the streets, the supporters of this government, going to the manifestations, asking for the suspension of the politics of isolation, and to come back to the normal situation, the normal life. Of course, the interesting thing is the core of these people are middle-class people. They are not people that are not, let's say, that they don't have the information about this disease. But they are people that accept themselves to put in a situation of confrontation because they are speaking in the name of a type of courage that we should have in this situation. And of course, this courage against what? Courage against the pandemic, courage against everything. But the interesting thing is, and this is a topic that the government say almost every day, we should, life is not the most important thing. Freedom is most important than life. Okay, for a Lacanian, is a very funny speech because of I can just remember this Seminary 11 saying something like, okay, but what is freedom without life? It's just a death. But by the way, but what is interesting thing is, of course, these people is disposed to sacrifice themselves because they know that they are on risk. They are not lobotomized. They know that they are on risk, but the risk is not. They don't care anymore. And it's not possible to remember what we saw, for example, in this Paul Villerio book about the suicidal state, the Nazi state as a suicidal state, when he said something like, "Well, let's say the essence of this state was reached in a telegram, in a leak. This leak number 71 is a leak when Hitler said something like, well, if the war is ended, Germany must perish. And well, of course, he used that as a strong example. And it's a very interesting thing because Adorno said something more or less similar in this conference that we published just last year about the extreme right, saying there is a type of desire of self-sacrifice. And we are seeing that. This is not just this necropolitical situation that I don't care about the life of the other. There's something more terrible. Is I don't care about my life too. And exactly because of this, let's say, these characteristics, I would like to stress this point. Well, there is a real strong danger for Brazil concerning this type of consolidation of fascist trend among us. Is that? Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Vladimir. Yes, I made some reference to that that lecture last week, and talked a little bit about maybe that is, you know, Adorno is very keen to distinguish the new radicalism of the far right in the post-war period from the 20s and 30s, but this is a kind of moment of continuity, the nihilism of the far right. And self-sacrifice is no longer a metaphor, but it's very much real. So referring to dialectic enlightenment. Good. So let's move on then. Last but certainly not least, we have Helmut-Harry Loewen, who has devoted over 3 decades to anti-fascist activism. Prior to his retirement in 2015, he taught for 22 years at the University of Winnipeg. First as a sessional lecturer in German studies and philosophy, and then as a member of the Department of Sociology. And just a couple of days ago, he was on the radio talking about the situation in the United States, and painted quite a stark picture of a kind of redoubled security state apparatus on the one side, and a resistance and an uprising that had a complex set of determinations, and was then, in a sense, showing that this was the landscape going forward. And so we're very delighted to have you with us, Helmut-Harry. Just like to say one thing about his participation, and that is that we were meant to have this book launch happen in person, and Helmut-Harry was going to come and comment on the book, but also do a separate lecture on anti-fascist organizing in Canada, and that had to be, in a sense, delayed. We definitely will have that happen at some point, but it's great to have you here. And I think one of the real advantages of being forced to go online is that we have the ability to have Ajay and Vladimir here with us online. So it's a new constellation. Take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Samir, and thank you to the panelists, both today and on the other 2 panels prior to this one. The book by Samir is a seminal contribution to our understanding of fascism in our present moment. Before I begin with a few comments, I too wish to acknowledge the ancestral lands upon which Winnipeg, Manitoba, where I am located, sort of in the center of the continent of North America. We are located on what is called here Treaty 1 territory, which are the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojibwe, Dene, Dakota peoples, and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. And Manitoba, my home province, is the only province which joined the Canadian Confederation in 1870 as a direct consequence of an Indigenous-led insurrection. That's a very key point, which has shaped radical histories in Manitoba and other parts of the prairies since the late part of the 19th century. And I mention here not just the resurgent Indigenous movements, which have shaped Manitoba history to this day, but workers' movements, the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, the so-called Battle of Old Market Square, which we are celebrating today on June 5th, the 86th anniversary of a major uprising on the streets of Winnipeg against Nazi groups operating in Winnipeg in 1933 and 1934. some of them under the direct direction of the Foreign Office of Adolf Hitler. And so in 1934, the Anti-Fascist League, which comprised workers from the Jewish communities and other ethno-cultural groups in Manitoba, fought a pitched battle against the Nationalist Party of Canada, which was one of 6 fascist organizations operating in Winnipeg, and defeated them on the street once and for all. And as the communist alderman, Joe Zuken, put it, Zuken was a participant that day. Zuken was also the longest serving communist elected official in North America, which makes Winnipeg sort of a very unique space in terms of left-wing history. And Zuken noted, since that day, Nazis were driven from Market Square. And I can tell you, as someone who's been involved, as Samir put it, in over 30 years of anti-fascist organizing here in Manitoba and in other parts of the country, that this whole notion of physically opposing, usually through mass numbers, but sometimes through direct confrontation, has worked in the city of Winnipeg. We have mounted anti-fascist mobilizations which have literally made it impossible for neo-Nazi and other fascist groups to gain any foothold in the city. And I'm speaking here from the home and from the studio of Yaron Walter, who is the grandson of Holocaust survivors. Right? His grandparents, the Rosenzweigs, both grandparents lost every member of the family during the Shoah, and it is Yaron who's been my anti-fascist comrade and Fred for about 27, 28 years, when he, as a young anti-racist skinhead, approached me one day at a bookstore, and eventually we became friends and organized a group called United Against Racism, which is part of the Anti-Racist Action Network in Manitoba in the 1990s. A very strong organization. Currently, we have a group called FF1, Fascist Free Treaty 1, which is a large organization that has mobilized up to 1,000 people in a city of some 750,000 to engage, when necessary, in public actions against neo-fascist groups like the Soldiers of Odin, anti-immigrant groups, white supremacists, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to acknowledge that history which takes place on this territory. Now, Samir had mentioned in his comments, as he does in his introduction, that security services, policing services, and intelligence agencies serve as harbingers of fascism. And it's a very compelling image. What is a harbinger? If one looks at the history of these terms, harbinger goes back, one of its roots, to the Proto-Germanic. Contained in the word harbinger is Herberge. A German youth hostel is a Jugendherberge. And a harbinger was sent forth by the king when the king went out on an expedition to scope out the territory and secure the lodging for the sovereign. It's a compelling image that Samir uses here to describe covert services as harbingers of fascism. Now, the German word for harbinger is Vorbote, equally protean. The Vorbote is the Bote, the messenger, right? The messenger has a Botschaft, a message. An ambassador is a Botschafter. The Vorbote is also sent out to secure a space for the sovereign. What a compelling image of what the policing services and the military are doing on the streets of Washington as we speak. Right? And so the word Vorbote has one last connection that I want to draw attention to. It's related to the English word foreboding. Foreboding. So to what extent are secret services complicit with fascist and other far-right organizations of foreboding? Well, from one perspective, and I find here the argument of philosopher Gabriel Rockhill compelling. He says in recent presentations, which he's going to work out in a forthcoming book, but in Paris he said last year, let's think about liberalism and fascism as two modes of governance, which operate in tandem with each other. The liberal mode of governance, or as we call it in Canada, is sort of the sunny-face liberalism of Trudeau. But equally, the fascist mode of governance emanates from the armed fist of the state and its secret services. And we have numerous examples, both from Germany and from Canada, which is part of my current research project, looking at what Samir also calls in his book, he points to an example of the German intelligence service as having been guilty of omission, sins of omission, crimes of omission, in terms of not going after neo-Nazis, including the terrorist network, the NSU, the National Socialist Underground, which for approximately 15 years went on a murder spree, a campaign of bombings, and so on, armed robberies, until it was finally disclosed in 2011. So the role of the German intelligence services from their very founding, right? After the war, Chancellor Adenauer set up the new BKA, Bundeskriminalamt, and other intelligence agencies, the BND. They were staffed by Nazis, by the Reinhard Gehlen network. So Hitler's spy masters now became the German spy masters. And we have similar dynamics in the United States, where the CIA then and in subsequent decades worked very closely with fascist organizations. It does so to this day. So do Canadian intelligence agencies. Look at Ukraine, for example. Okay? So harbingers of fascism ties in very well with this whole notion of specters, of the materialization of these groups. So very briefly, in Germany, before I get to a few Canadian cases, in Germany, you had the case of the National Socialist Underground, right? Members of which, the trio of three, although it was supported by a broad network, they had been known by the intelligence services when they began their activities, but nothing was done. Instead, the immigrant shopkeepers who had been assassinated at short range on 9 different occasions over numerous years with the same gun, the intelligence agency said, well, these are crimes committed by Turkish organized gangs and so on. In other words, these crimes were blamed on immigrant communities, when in fact, as eventually became disclosed, these were neo-Nazis supported by networks which had been facilitated in part by the secret services. So as Samir again puts it in a number of places, in Germany, the intelligence service is called the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz. The very agencies intended to defend the Constitution subvert it and put people's lives in danger. A point that was made just yesterday in the German edition of Jacobin, when Martina Renner, an elected parliamentarian from the Bundestag, published a long article saying these intelligence services put people's lives in danger by facilitating, by enabling, ermöglichen neo-Nazi violence. So we have these cases in Germany. We've had other cases in which, more recently, and this is an ongoing scandal in Germany, it has been journalists and anti-fascist researchers who have disclosed and found the evidence of, for example, KKK networks among German police services in Baden-Württemberg, neo-Nazi networks in the Frankfurt police, right? In Hessen, which Adorno, in his lecture on right-wing extremism, that lecture that he gave in Vienna to the socialist students in 1967, which was just published last year and became a bestseller, Adorno specifically mentions Hessen in a certain region as involved sort of in the intergenerational transmission of these fascist authoritarian attitudes. So in Hessen, we have these activities. Martina Renner, the parliamentarian, in her article yesterday, tallies up the body count and says within the space of about 3 or 4 months, in 3 different cities, 14 people have been killed by neo-Nazi attacks. She says this reminds her of Germany in 1980, right after the neo-Nazi bombing of the Oktoberfest in Munich. There was a wave of Nazi violence across Germany. And people point, quite often, well, the problem in Germany has been so-called left-wing terrorism. By closing an eye, in German they say one closes the right eye to the terrorism coming from these fascist groups. So fascism, fascist violence, and liberalism operate in tandem and present us with a highly contradictory terrain for analysis and disaggregating. Now in Canada, I've been involved in many, many cases, sometimes very personal, sometimes too closely up front. Patricia mentioned some of the Indigenous victims of violence and murder and death at the hands of the police and other agencies here in Canada. Let me add another name to that list. The Cree trapper Carney Nerland. In January of 1991, Nerland, a trapper from a First Nation just north of Prince Albert, came to town wanting to sell his furs. He came to a shop, a pawn and gun shop run by Carney Nerland, and was gunned down by Nerland in the course of their interactions. I know this case intimately from a whole range of ways. Now, what we do know, for example, Nerland was a gun dealer. He had access to all sorts of semi-automatic and other weapons. And at one point, before he shot Nerland dead, he did what Nazi guards did to Jews in the camps. He fired his semi-automatic weapon at the foot of this man to make him dance around the bullets. Now, who was Carney Nerland? Carney Nerland was a leader of the Aryan Nations. He was an organizer for the KKK. That store that I mentioned in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, served as the recruitment center for the KKK. Prior to that, he had served in various capacities. He was a bodyguard and the driver for David Duke, the former Klan leader and white supremacist in Louisiana. And before that, Carney Nerland engaged in paramilitary training with Chilean Nazi groups in South America. He was well connected. Eventually, after the RCMP got him on weapons charges, they turned him into an informant. Okay? So he did what they say in the business. He was burning both ends of the stick. So he was organizing for the neo-Nazis, killing an Indigenous man in 1991 as a neo-Nazi, and as a police informant. So after serving 2.5 years, 2.5 years for gunning down Nerland, he was released into witness protection program. But here's where another aspect of the state comes in. There was a commission of inquiry, which the putatively social democratic government, the NDP government, had called to examine the circumstances of Nerland's killing. And after 2 years of inquiries, I attended every session. What did this panel conclude? I quote, "We have no evidence of organized racism in Saskatchewan." So a known white supremacist kills an Indigenous person. Nerland told the Prince Albert arresting officer, and I'm quoting now, "If I'm convicted of killing that Indian, I should get a medal and you should pin it on me." There are other statements I can't quote publicly here. Right? Now this is Carney Nerland. And one example of how the state funding of white supremacists funneling people into white supremacist groups actually has lethal results, and was involved in the building up of white supremacist networks. Right? You had the Heritage Front in Toronto in the early 1990s, right? The largest white supremacist group in Canadian history. It was co-founded and run by Grant Bristow, a paid agent of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. He committed all sorts of crimes in that capacity, funneled money into it. Eventually, the Heritage Front was brought down, not by what Grant Bristow did, but by what former members like Elisa Hannigan, testifying against members of the Heritage Front, and particularly the work of anti-fascist groups like Anti-Racist Action, with which all of us were involved at the time and since then. So you have these various examples, including white supremacists in the military, which is a problem to this day, right? And it raises the question of the state involvement, the state, and this will be my last point since I understand that I've gone way over, the state purports to fight what it calls extremism. But I think we need to look very carefully at not just the limitations of sort of extremism models, similar to what Vladimir said, right? This very problematic positing of equivalences between left and right populism. The positing of equivalences between so-called left-wing extremism and right-wing extremism is deeply flawed, has no empirical basis, and simply serves as a way to target the left. And I think I'll leave it at that at this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Helmut-Harry. That was a fascinating discussion, and I think it leads now nicely into our question and answer session. I see that we have just a little over 15 minutes to 12, but we can go over 12, go past 12 a little bit if we like. So I would like now just to get to questions. There's a question here that Ajay has been directed at Ajay in particular. You've seen it, Ajay. Do you maybe want to just reiterate the crux of it? It's quite long. It's from our friend Danny Postel, who's been thinking a lot about right-wing populism these days, and perhaps you could just encapsulate it and then answer it. It'd be good just to have this for the recording, so people, when they're seeing this after the fact, know what it is you're answering. And remember to unmute.
Yeah. So Danny has asked an interesting question in terms of why left refrains from seeing this process of fascism from below, and they keep emphasizing the fact that it is actually state-driven and top-down rather than being built from below. I think it calls for an interesting. I think it partly it demands a theoretical answer that because partly left sees this process as a structural process linked to social structures, and so they often see this fascism as emergence or fallout of a crisis in neoliberalism or capitalism. So they see it as a dead end of capitalism or a realignment of within neoliberal forces. So I think the structural explanation partly compels them to offer this kind of a top-down. And the second reason that comes to my mind is that left for long has avoided culture. And partly that, I think, comes from the fact that their understanding of culture itself as necessarily being conservative. They equate culture with a certain kind of a conservatism, and therefore they've not really theorized in the post-colonial context. And therefore that's where I argue that we are in a different social setting in terms of where we do have social structures, but those social positionalities, I think they've got differentiated. And in terms of their own self-representation, there is a certain kind of a play that is now possible, that you cannot reduce politics immediately to the social positionality. If we go by this, I think one can partly explain why people might imagine their politics quite contrary to their material interests. And I think the far-right Hindu project in India to become this new hegemony, partly I think this explains as to they're able to offer a certain kind of an social, cultural, emotive narrative that speaks to the cultural structures, to cultural codes that exist in terms of popular memory, in terms of myths, available mythologies. So the frames through which people represent themselves, I think, have been signified by right-wing politics.
Thank you very much, Ajay. So now I'd like to go to Patricia first, and then Joan for another question. Patricia, just to translate the question, how is it that the Canadian state is so seemingly well able to manage its let's say self-image so well? You know, obviously there are a lot of Canadians who believe in this mythology, but it also seems to resonate globally. There's a certain kind of image of Canada that seems very hard to shake. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's it's a complicated answer, and yet it's also simple, right? In lots of ways. As I mentioned in the chapter, you know, a lot of Canada's belief in itself is always as the, you know, the sort of the child of the British Empire who managed to overcome the problems of the British Empire, right? And in its embracing of the bringing of others here, right? Multiculturalism is a huge part of our fantasy of how we are a good place, right? Compared directly to the sort of racial politics of the U.S. melting pot. You know, that rhetoric was huge, you know, especially in the 1980s and early 1990s, as many of you will know. And in terms of Indigenous settler relations in Canada, whether those are white settlers or people who came to be considered white settlers over time, because as we know, the definition of whiteness in Canada, as in the US, as in other places, has changed over time, right? There's a co-opting into the mythology of the post-settler society that Canada is, into the dream of sort of white liberalism and capitalism and then neo-capitalism, in a way, though, in Canada that is gentle, right? Or perceived to be gentle, again, through this sort of idea of we accept and bring in, as opposed to we oppress and dominate. Now, all of that, of course, flies in the face of the historical realities of Canada's past, but we're also not good at advertising those realities, obviously, right? And as a country with a largely small population for the landmass, especially compared to the U.S. below us, and the dynamics of sort of the grandness of U.S. politics and world perception, Canada has always been perceived as sort of the nice upstairs neighbor to, you know, a house party, as it were, down south. And that's a mythology that Canada has bought into, right? And in glossing over the issues that I think Helmut-Harry spoke to very eloquently about our very specific white supremacist past, present, and potentially future, you know, Canada's perception is very different from its reality, and the sort of global stage of peacekeepers and multiculturalism was something that Canada was just really, really good at selling. And so that the history hasn't come out in the same way.
Thank you very much, Patricia. So now a question for Joan, and then I'm going to ask question that I think all panelists can take a stab at, but I think it's particularly relevant to this whole discussion of a certain sort of fascism from below, and how we address that. Perhaps maybe we can then go on to looking at how we, in a sense, organize and get active against these forces within our society. And I think that Helmut-Harry has already put so much on the table there in terms of what in a sense must be done. So, but let me come to you, Joan. The question has been asked, you probably saw it there, about a potentially Gandhian intervention as opposed to the right interpretation of the Gita and the Kali Yuga and so on. That might also, in a sense, be relevant to the certain perception of what's going on down, well, in your country, which is that the perception might be that there's a lot of violent protests going on, whereas in fact, it seems the reality is that police are instigating violence amongst people who are very upset for a number of reasons. But there might be this kind of attempt to play off certain, strains within the radical tradition, the black radical tradition in particular, against, say, the legacy of Gandhi, or a particular reading of Martin Luther King Jr. So I'm wondering if you'd like to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't follow Indian politics closely enough to really give a good answer on that. It sounds like they're saying there's a right-wing appropriation of Gandhi. Is that how you're reading this person's comment? Or are they talking about a left-wing opposition to the far right? Oh, Samir, you're silent. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think it's actually, it is a bit of a difficult question to follow, but I think it's a kind of a Gandhian counter. And Ajay, feel free also to wade in here as well. You read the question too. A different interpretation of the Hindu tradition, which isn't, this sort of quasi or proto-fascist one.
Yeah, I mean, well, I will just say quickly, this is the stuff that I've been looking at isn't real Hinduism. It's like really bizarre fascist ideology, kind of, but it also did make inroads in India, right? So like Savitri Devi lived in India. That's not even her real name. She changed her name to sound Indian. So, and there are, like, esoteric Hitlerism has a history in India and it has a global history. I do want to separate that from like Hinduism in general. Bannon, the Gita was mentioned. Bannon is super into the Bhagavad Gita, but it's all read through this very peculiar traditionalist esoteric mythology. But if Ajay has thoughts on the current stuff, I'd be interested.
Yeah, Ajay, would you like to comment?
Yeah, what Joan argued, I mean, partly this kind of a question comes from the fact that Gandhi in contemporary Indian politics has been appropriated by the right, one, and then the Dalit and subaltern groups for long have been offering a critique of Gandhi. For instance, as being in Africa, he is known to be racist. In India, he is also known to be anti-Dalit. At one point in time, he supported the Varna system in terms of his interpretation of Gita and so on and so forth. So I think that's kind of the context, and it produces very productive questions, very productive tensions in terms of how to appropriate Gandhi, because there is a certain kind of critical traditionalism in Gandhi. There's a critique of modernity, which is very robust in terms of colonial modernity, in terms of Western civilization, industrialization. And the other interesting aspect is he tried to tie that critique to preserving some idea of the collective, which he thought was that existed in the traditional communitarian life. I think that allows for Gandhi to be located in a hyphenated space. It is sort of so both right is currently appropriating Gandhi in terms of highlighting his traditionalism, while I think left should have also ideally appropriate certain aspects of critical traditionalism Gandhi, which has not happened. So partly I think that answers.
Thanks very much. Well, we mustn't ever forget as well that Gandhi's assassin was close to or a member of the RSS, right? And that's close ally within civil society, Hindu fundamentalist ally of the current BJP government, which is something always to remember. Gandhi's own history and biography in South Africa is itself deeply complicated. He himself wasn't free from the scourge of racism, as we know. Now, a question for I think for all of you, but in particular, I'd like to take up this question of populism, and I want to base it on something that Adorno says in the lecture on the new right extremism, and that is that one way to counteract these tendencies amongst the followers of these groups is to appeal to their interests, or at least encourage a certain self-reflection on whether their interests are being served by these organizations. There's been a lot of talk in recent years, particularly in the academy. And Ajay, I know you focus on this a lot in your interpretation of Hindutva and Modi. There's been a lot of emphasis on feeling, on affect, and it's almost as if there is a kind of exhaustion with public reason. But I'm wondering if we can completely do without this, that we need to actually have discussions about whether or not actual, as opposed to apparent or illusory, needs and interests are being served by far right and even centrist kinds of political formations. And that might take us then into a more acute discussion by which we can differentiate amongst populisms and not then be in a position where it's either the status quo, the neoliberal technocracy, or a kind of populism of either left or right beyond the pale. Anything that threatens the status quo is something ruled out in advance. So I'd just like to throw that out there to all of you, but let's, because it came up in particular in Vladimir's presentation, and also Helmut-Harry, you came back to it at the end of your presentation. Maybe we could start there and then see who else wants to come in.
Okay, well, thank you for the question, Samir. First, I would insist that I don't see the reason to make a strong distinction between affect in one side and public reason on another side, because it's affect is a kind of judgment, and I think it's a rhetorical way to say something like they are irrational, and we have our rationality, because for them, in their perspective, well, we are totally ideological. What we are doing here is a total ideological perspective, and they are totally rational. We work, for example, in some groups of right wing, and this is a very interesting topic. How they try to put themselves as a very rational person. They that can see the things that we cannot see, because we were educated in a type of frame, we were educated in a type of ideology, and we are not allowed to think by ourselves. And for example, what is at least for me is very interesting is how they use in a certain way some structures of reasoning that are at our side. For example, at least in Brazil, it's very clear how this fascist trends, they use the notion of freedom of self-ownership. They say some things like, for example, why I don't use a mask, I do in the streets, because it's my body is my rule. If I'm infected, it's my problem, because I have the ownership of myself. What, in a certain way, if you what I will say is it's true. If you accept this notion of freedom, this is a possible consequence. Maybe the interesting question is, well, which kind of notion of freedom we have? If this maybe this type of let's say reason by abstract show us some problems with in some notions that for us it's clear and evident. and maybe it's not so clear and so evident. Then this is the reason that I would also insist that when you describe this, these types of political perspectives as a regression, I think there is also a problem in this in this description, because of course regression, but upon which point of view? Because for them this is not a regression at all. No? On the contrary, actually, we are in the regressive position, and I think that we should deal with this for to better understand just this phenomenon.
Thank you very much. Helmut-Harry, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. I certainly agree with the analysis of Vladimir and don't have much to add to that. If I can slightly address your question by shifting my response slightly, because this does relate to the point I sort of ended with earlier, we need to be very precise in our analysis. And it's certainly right, as Samir and others have warned against the overinflated use of the term fascism, denouncing anybody who disagrees with us as fascist, proto-fascist, and so on. We don't do that or do ourselves any favor on the left with this lazy deployment of these terms of invective. At the same time, we need to be understanding of the importance of centering anti-fascism within the projects of the left. And where the left, broadly understood, especially in North America, has gone amiss, in my view, or has been deformed in many ways, is through neoliberal identity politics, which are still very much au courant among various left-wing formations, especially among the left liberal, social democratic left, but also beyond that. I think the critiques of identity politics by Adolf Reed Jr. and a whole range of other critics. In fact, I should mention here Samir Gandesha as a key critic of this form of left-wing identity politics. We need to develop those ideas and firmly ground what I call an anti-fascist analysis. And what an anti-fascist analysis does, as Robin Marasco puts it, the critical theorist puts it, she says, critical theory offers us many resources to develop an anti-fascist politics, right? We have those resources in, for example, Walter Benjamin and Bertolt Brecht's discussions in the late 1920s about interventionist thinking, eingreifendes Denken. Adorno makes a similar point with his notion of interventions, Eingriffe. Gabriel Rockhill, more recently, with a whole book on the philosophy of interventions. Now, interventions from an anti-fascist perspective means, on the one hand, on the streets, we intervene, intervenire, we come between fascists and those who defend the community. This is what Cornel West, the philosopher, referred to when he thanked anti-fascists for, quote, saving our lives by intervening between clergy who were praying on the one side and armed fascist militias on the other side. So there's intervention in that sense, but I would like to extend the notion into academic discourse. And academic anti-fascist interventionist thinking would disrupt the categories that we lazily accept as they are drafted by the state. Concepts like extremism, terrorism, hate crime, and so on and so forth. And my bone to pick with most academics in Canada who work in this area, hate crime scholarship, terrorism, right-wing extremism, they accept money from counter-terrorism offices of the federal government, right? Public Safety Canada, one example, Public Safety Canada spent over $4 million in Edmonton some 3 years ago. About $3 million went to the police. Over $1 million went to an academic researcher to write a report that, had my students submitted it, I would have said, go back and do it again, right? Because what this report said was, we have many examples of extremism in Alberta, and he mentioned 7 different groups, right? The Blood and Honor neo-Nazi gang, the white supremacists, the KKK, and so on and so forth, and anti-fascists and anarchists. And then Dr. McCoy says, but of course, we have no evidence of any violence having been committed by Antifa, but there is that possibility. As I said earlier, this whole extremism discourse, its main target is not the right wing, it is the left, right? And Trump understands that. Trump understands that when he says, I'm going to declare Antifa a terrorist organization, he can't do it, but it doesn't matter, right? Because he has put that discourse out there. It's my last point. He has told his police officers and the soldiers on the street, these anti-fascists and their friends, they are terrorists. It's open season. Do with them what you will, right? The hit is literally on.
Thank you so much. I would just like to make a couple of points while I remember them. Absolutely, this is a kind of ramping up of what Trump had said earlier, and the message was not particularly coded, was it? You know, when you're putting the perpetrator into the police car and you're being nice, don't be nice. That obviously is license to the police to engage in even more brutal policing. And so this is exactly the kind of logic. But I also just wanted to draw attention to the fact that a couple of years ago, SFU itself put together a master's program in terrorism, risk, and security studies for really police and CSIS officers. And I watched a couple of my colleagues who were defending this, and they said, well, of course, people have some worries about oversight and liberal democracy and this kind of thing. But we need this. If we don't do this, we're at risk. I was absolutely flabbergasted by this. Just a quick point, and then I'll open it up again to the other panelists. But I think that Vladimir, what you were saying in your presentation really does, not in the answer to your question, to the question necessarily, but in the presentation where you're talking about the suicidal nature of the state, the suicidal nature of fascism. We have here really a very different premise, don't we? Because we say interest starts with the very first interest, which is interest in self-preservation. If you don't have that, we're not talking about the same things, right? We're not having, there's no possibility of rational discourse at this point. It falls off the edge. So I think this is really where in some ways we are at. Who would now like to come in and perhaps respond to the question, or if you have other thoughts, panelists? Maybe give a show of a hand or a finger.
I have a couple thoughts. I think I mainly just want to second Helmut-Harry's point about extremism. And I think populism plays the same kind of role, right? Where we've created these terms, or not we, but the state has created these terms that intentionally blur those lines, and it serves fascism very well too, right? So if you look at how Bannon is able to say that he's a populist and confuse people, or try to confuse people about the boundaries between left and right by using this kind of rhetoric of the elites, that sort of blurring of left and right seems to serve both the state and fascism. And we have just such a huge, huge problem with mass recruitment into fascist and far-right ideology right now in the US. I mean, I really don't think there's a single teenager that hasn't been exposed to neo-Nazi memes, that hasn't had some, neo-Nazi using racial slurs with them on video games. It's just so rampant. And any kind of government response coming through the Trump administration, I don't think could be trusted. And so many of the very few projects that have been designed to push back against that and supposedly rescue youth or others from extremism are engaged in these government grants and government projects. And so the rhetoric that you get from that then is all about how, you know, both sides are basically the same. The problem is Antifa as much as the right, and, you know, polarization is the problem. And if you challenge that rhetoric, you're basically told that you're part of the problem. You're causing fascism by critiquing the rhetoric. So I guess I'm just kind of agreeing with you, but I think it's a huge problem, and I'm seeing it here too. And I think it's getting so much worse even just this week with the way Trump has framed Antifa as the enemy and trying to split the Black Lives Matter movement around that. So it's timely for sure.
Patricia, please.
Thanks. And thanks to everybody for your comments and for these great questions to the folks who are listening. I just wanted to say, you know, it's such a typical response of violent colonial states to do this, right? I mean, the reframing of Indigenous resistance for all of colonialism's history in this way, where we become the enemy, where the danger lives inherently in us, where we are the risk factor, right? Whereas actually colonialism is the risk factor, and the violence of the colonial state is the risk factor, is such an old trope, right? That this happens so regularly. And, you know, as Helmut-Harry talked about, you know, the Métis resistance to the colonial state that ended up, you know, in the formation of Manitoba, has been reframed over and over and over again through Canada's history. You know, it's very nice history, as a resistance, right? As a rebellion, as when in fact it was an assertion of sovereignty, right? A resistance to the state and its violence, and the violence of the RCMP, which continues to this day. So I just wanted to add that, because it's such a trope.
Just to go back to the question that you raised, Samir, in terms of this play between affective dimension of feelings and reason, I think that seems to be really at the heart of much of what we are discussing here, which also I think sort of makes this process of what we're calling fascism from below really a complex process, is because emotions are not merely in terms of, they're not merely experiential, but they're also evaluative as reason. So people evaluate through something that we could refer to perhaps as emotional reasoning, and I think it's also at the heart of it is also the heart crisis of modernity itself, that even Weber points out to that in terms of rationality and reason on one end, it sort of expands our notions of autonomy and freedom, but there is another dark side to modernity and rationality and reason in terms of new forms of domination and control they bring into. I think what I see in the rise of whether this kind of a populist authoritarian regimes or what we could refer to as fascism, I think is a certain kind of crisis of modernity that takes us back to this assumption that we have had that modern societies are transparent and self-referential, while the traditional societies had myth and meaning. But I think now the populist regimes have made it very clear that at the heart of populism is bringing back of myth and meaning. I think they're able to generate narratives, feelings of going back to creating new myths. And modern society and modern individuals do need, and I think consumer culture and Frankfurt School dealt with this, I think has created a differentiated society where the creation of meaning itself has become, I think there's a kind of a spiritual crisis in modern societies. And populists are, in a perverted sense, mobilizing that dark side of modernity.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, this is the thesis not just of the culture industry, but the very logic of the dialectic of enlightenment, the interconnection of enlightenment and myth centering on sacrifice and self-renunciation. I think this is really the crux of it. From my perspective, I think this is the crux of it. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. I'm very mindful as well of the fact that Ajay has been very good and very collegial and comradely to be with us at such a late hour. It's nearly 1 a.m. in Delhi. So I don't think we can detain him for much longer. But I would like to just do a kind of round amongst the panelists now for final thoughts, and maybe some thoughts on what can be done. And maybe we should go in, let's say, in reverse order. So let's start with you, Vladimir.
Said what can be done? We organize a manifestation for the 30 June. If there is some Brazilians in the audience, I will say, well, I know that we are in a pandemic situation, but we have no choice anymore, because actually we should go to the streets. And then we are doing what we can do. We are trying to organize nets and connections with persons that are just against this government and so on. But one point that I would stress is, this is not something that will change in the next week. These fascist strains, they are here and they will stay. And actually, this asks us a new type of clarification, I think. A type of ideological clarification. Our politics went to the streams. And in this situation, I really think that the left wing should be able to occupy another anti-institutional pole as a way, let's say, to create a type of balance and not lead them with all this discourse against the institutions.
Thanks very much. Patricia, please.
Thanks so much, everybody. What can we do? I mean, with all due respect, we're doing it. You know, we've been actively resisting the Canadian state for as long as the Canadian state has existed, and we continue to. And that means we die, right? I mean, literally. And it's an ongoing battle, and you know, people are in the streets, or they're blockading, or they are, you know, they're resisting arrest, or they're, you know, resisting the child welfare agencies that are coming to take their children across this country. So we're doing it. And, you know, I applaud everybody who's mobilizing to take action in all of the different ways that they are against oppression, and to raise awareness, and in allyship and in solidarity. So
thanks very much. Joan.
I think we're in a very precarious moment here in the US, and I don't know exactly what to do. I think it's important to show up and support the movement for Black lives. That's the biggest and most important thing happening. So kind of my view on where we're at is we are just on the brink of fascism. And I've resisted calling the US a fascist state for quite a while, partially because I just think strategically, once you say that, people start thinking, well, you know, why are we holding our forums in public? Everything should be underground. And you just start thinking strategically differently. And we're still able to do a lot of our work in public. But when that announcement came out this week, you know, that Trump was saying, well, last week that Trump was saying that Antifa was going to be labeled a terrorist organization, and that he was going to call upon the US military to intervene in this sort of Schmittian state of exception in cities. And at the same time, what's not acknowledged by the Trump administration, but which everyone that follows this here knows, and I'm sure you all know as well, is we're having massive issues of policing by like civilian vigilantes, militia groups and neo-Nazi groups and so on. I'm in the Northwest US. I'm in Spokane, Washington, which has a huge history of this stuff. We're right in the middle of the Northwest Territorial Imperative, which was like this whole attempt to move white people to this area and create a sort of secessionist state. And so here in Spokane, but it's happening everywhere. We had this past weekend, very little property damage. Somebody broke a Nike store window, very little in terms of that stuff. But the police response was so draconian. We had people being tear gassed. We had people being, there were grenades and all kinds of stuff I've never seen here before. Helicopters, curfews. At the same time that we had like vigilantes patrolling the streets with the cops, basically. So I don't know, that is not a strategy, but that's my sense of the lay of the land. Like we are like right on the brink and we need like everybody out there doing something. And I don't know strategically or tactically exactly what, but like it needs to happen like right now because we're like right at a moment of figuring out where we're at.
Thanks, Joan. I mean, I just want to, I'm not sure everybody out there will know this. I do because I follow you on social media, but I know that you are very active in anti-racism and anti-fascism, and I commend you for that. And you're very modest not to raise that. So you do that, and I think supporting Black Lives Matter and other Black organizations is really crucial in this moment. But I think also, as Vladimir said, we really need to look at a long-term horizon. This isn't going away tomorrow. We need not just to be active, but to organize for long term and provide an anti-institutional kind of perspective and response. Thank you. So now over to Ajay.
Yeah, I mean, situation in India too is quite precarious. I mean, last few months there have been arrests of known public activists. There have been arrests of young student leaders against CA and NRC bill. That was my own students from my own university in JNU have been put under dreaded anti-terrorist activities under that section of law. So now the state is closing in, and situation is quite precarious in terms of anti-Muslim propaganda is also at its peak, and India is now almost staring at a possible genocide and mass violence against Muslims, along with left liberal activists. So the Hindu right is actually assuming to completely take over the Indian state, and it believes that it is here in power for quite a long time. So, and it's making preparations accordingly. So I think it's time that in India want to have forged solidarities, international solidarities, and as I said, we need a new kind of a left lingo that goes beyond this kind of legal constitutional language. We can talk in terms of popular language, more effective dimension, take on popular memory and myths. I think there has been a demassification of left politics in India, which has been only able to address a very small educated literate section. Now I think we need to revisit that in terms of street mobilization and reoccupy some of the categories that right has used in terms of traditions, myths, past, and and that I think is the only possible chance that we really have.
Thanks very much. And I also just should add to what I said a second ago in relation to Joan, and that it's Black organizations need support, but Indigenous ones as well, especially in Canada. I understand maybe Patricia could provide further information on this, but I understand there's going to be an I don't know more demonstration midweek, and it seems like this would be a kind of propitious moment for that organization to be once again very present in the public sphere. So thank you, Ajay, for your comment. And now, last but not least, Helmut-Harry.
Samir and panelists. Thank you so much, Samir and panelists. terms of what to do, tonight in Winnipeg at 6 p.m. Central Time, Black Lives Matter has organized a Justice for Black Lives rally on the grounds of the Manitoba legislature. Thousands are expected. We know that in Vancouver recently, in Calgary in particular, 10 to 15,000 people have been showing up for these massive rallies. What Antifa is doing in Winnipeg is joining with Black Lives Matter, and in particular with urban Indigenous warriors and peacekeepers to keep the peace at this rally. Keep the peace in terms of police provocations, and we know that some of the local far-right agitators have said, we're going to show up, we support fights against police brutality, but they're coming to agitate, and they will be marginalized. Not violently, but we have also strategies to sort of suffocate that type of agitation. But you never know, right? The police in Winnipeg have a brutal racist reputation, especially in terms of policing Black and Indigenous bodies. The police have been told not to show up for the rally, but of course, Black Lives Matter has no control over that. But the fight is against the police, as we've said, and against their friends in the far right wing. So that's what we're doing tonight. Yaron, Omar Kinnerath from FF1, and our comrades in various urban Indigenous groups. This is what makes Winnipeg unique as well, like the way in which anti-fascists work hand in glove with Indigenous activists. We have some of that in Vancouver. Gord Hill, the artist who wrote the anti-fascist comic book, has been involved in street-level Antifa since the 1990s, for heaven's sake, right? An old comrade from that front. And so these voices joining up with Antifa from Indigenous communities are crucial to our work, and we thank them for those contributions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd also like to add that there's been a long history of anti-fascist and anti-racist organizing within the South Asian communities here, especially out in the Fraser Valley for decades, particularly the Punjabi farm workers have been absolutely integral in organizing very concerted anti-fascist and anti-racist front, particularly against the KKK. Basically drove the KKK well underground, if not out of the province. So something I like to remember and acknowledge, and that's also something that can be built on in the present. We've had a question that sort of flew under the radar, which unfortunately I don't think we can properly address, but it's more like a comment, and it's quite a strong comment from our friend Danny Postel, who again I respect very highly, and he seems to think that we are a little bit in denial as a panel, those of us who have spoken a bit about, and also some of us have written about populism, that we don't want to acknowledge it as a mostly right-wing political formation. I'm not sure that we are in that kind of a denial, but certainly we can say that with the seeming defeat of Sanders' candidacy, with the routing of the Corbyn left within the Labour Party, denouement of momentum, you have also other developments in Spain with Podemos and so on. It seems that left populism that seemed hopeful for a time is in a kind of abeyance. But I don't think that there's a sense that it's not predominantly, especially now, a right-wing force that has very majoritarian kind of dimension, very exclusionary, targeting various enemies of the people from the groups that have been mentioned: migrants, people of color, Indigenous people. In any case, it would be nice to develop that further. It is now the point in the proceedings for me to thank all of the panelists for these wonderful presentations. Thank you, Helmut-Harry, for providing some very useful comments on the manuscript as it was being edited and going into the press. And of course, thank you to the contributors for your excellent chapters. I think made this book really quite unique in addressing the developments that we're seeing around us, really from a global perspective, and I think that's very important. Again, a special thank you for Ajay for staying up way past his bedtime, I'm sure. Thank you to the audience for your comments and questions. It's been really wonderful to have you with us. And finally, I would like to thank Huyen Pham for all of the incredible work she does for the Institute. Setting these discussions up over the last 3 weeks has been particularly challenging, just in terms of getting schedules organized and so on across different time zones. So I really appreciate her efforts. Thank you. So please, wherever you are, try and support Black and Indigenous-led movements of resistance to the increasing tightening of the state's hold on our society. Support Antifa. Join these organizations. Get active. There's no way of there's no room today for complacency. So thank you all, and we will see you again. All the best.